Okay, so I'm going to talk about the role of slabs and weak layers in fracture arrest. And this is some work that we've been doing on bacon rind for a really long time now, including we collected some additional data just yesterday. And I'd like to acknowledge Eric and Mark because they moved the most snow. Absolutely. And this was something that we had actually talked about real early in the season. Then I'll show you a video of their first day here. And then I've been going there since. And it also comes from some discussions I've had with Alec and with Ron and with Ned Bear, some of the things that we did here. And with Doug, too, there at the Gallatin Center. And the Gallatin Center always gives me a ton of support in terms of not only forecasters coming out, but odds and everything else to try and zero me in on places where things might be happening. So the goal of this work was to see how changes in slabs and weak layers might affect whether or not fractures arrest. So, we were talking before about propagation, and Bruce mentioned some things about arrest. And so here I'm trying to figure out what are the factors, if we can get a fracture to begin to propagate, okay? We can get that weak layer to fracture. How can we get that fracture to arrest? And what we started doing is we used propagation saw tests because we wanted to do the least amount of bending in the slab or anything and just have the most pure test for just getting that fracture initiated. And then we did modifications to our weak layer. So we would completely interrupt the weak layer. So that the weak layer was separate from what was going on. We'd remove the weak layer and create gaps. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then also did some work where we tried to support the slab as much and to eliminate collapse and see if that could arrest the fracture. We also did some modifications to the slab. We cut the slabs from the surface down, and we also cut the slabs from the weak layer up to see how much of that slab was necessary to communicate that fracture along. So I had to put this in here. I don't know. How many people have already seen this? Okay, so this is an anti-crack in action. All right? And he's working on creating a critical crack length. Okay? And you will see, yeah, this is scarier than dealing with a deep slab. All right? And each time, can you imagine that there's more and more stress on each one of these? And so each one becomes a little bit easier for him to break. He doesn't have a critical crack length, does he? Because it's not propagating on its own. But this is an anti-crack that is going to collapse his silo. Oh, it's getting easier. Oh, do it again. Do it again. Come on. Slab seem relatively safe. So, with crack propagation, we have both of our slab. It's really all about the slab and the weak layer together, right? We need a slab that's going to help communicate the fracture, and you need just sort of the right slab and weak layer combination. And this is a graphic out of a paper that Dave Gaudier and Bruce Jameson presented at ISSW, and it's just looking at this sort of the way, one of the things that they were talking about was that maybe having the slab fracture occur when this length is less than critical would be a way for the fracture to arrest. And it made us start thinking, I wonder if we could just take these propagation saw tests and start modifying the slabs and modifying the weak layer. Like, what happens if we put something through the weak layer? What happens if we cut the slab? What happens if we support the slab? What effect might that have on fracture arrest? So I want everybody to remember that we're dealing with propagation saw tests, okay? And let's see, a number of the tests I'll show you. The length of our beams varied from 1 meter to 2.5 meters by the end. And we're really sort of forcing that fracture to just travel right along that one plane. And that's not the same as an avalanche, okay? In an avalanche, we've got fractures going all over the place. And so what makes the fracture arrest here might not be exactly the same as what's making the fracture arrest in a real avalanche. But at least it's going to be a starting point. We have some sort of controlled experiment that we can look at the effect of slabs and weak layers on arrest in the propagation saw test. So here we are. It's this big open meadow near Bacon Rind. The gully is over in this direction here. And so, like I said, just nice big open area of snow, and we actually started on one end and moved to the other, and we did propagation saw tests. I mean, we must have gone at least 50 meters across the slope, maybe even more. And so we visited the site actually 9 times now in 8 weeks, because we just went yesterday. Collected a snow profile and multiple tests on the targeted weak layer, which was a buried layer of surface hoar, which was deposited at the same time as that surface hoar picture I showed you earlier down at Lionhead. And the depth of the slab varied from 39 to 81 centimeters. And I forget what the depth was yesterday. It was closer to 1 meter, I think. Maximum densities increased from 160 to 340, so 16 to 34% over the time period. And maximum hardness in the slab increased from forefinger to knife over that 7 weeks. So this is what the snowpack looked like on the first day there when Mark and Eric went. And so we've got, you know, our nice surface hoar layer, about a 40 centimeter deep slab, and you know, the strongest layer is down here at forefinger. This is what it looked like a week ago. A lot of pencil here. This is now pencil plus. Here we have a very strong knife hard ice layer, and the slab depth then was about over 80 centimeters. So I'm going to start out with this video that Mark and Eric took on their first day there.
So what we're dealing with is we have a layer of surface hoar here. You can see the stripe in the snow, pretty big surface hoar. And the slab is really soft. It's like fist minus right here. Just a little bit harder here, kind of like fist plus, and 4 fingers here. So I'm going to do a regular PST right here. We could get pretty consistent propagation. Right there, that was at about 10 centimeters. After about 10 centimeters, propagate it all the way up.
All right, so now I'm just going to disrupt the top 10 centimeters at fist minus snow on top of the column. I'm just going to just cut.
Can you hear Eric? He's cutting it 10 centimeters down through fist minus snow at the surface, okay? It's fist minus. He goes and does the PST and gets slab fracture.
As you can see, right where I disrupted that new snow, just the top 10 centimeters, we had a fracture arrest, slab fracture arrest right there. So just this part right here is making all the difference between propagation and no propagation.
And so a big message right there that those guys came back with was, if you're doing these tests on really soft slabs, boy, don't mess with the top of your slab. Could have a big influence on what happens with your test. So what else was I going to say there? I forgot. Anyways, so after that, we started doing a lot of particle image velocimetry. It's just a fancy way of saying that we're trying to see how these different dots are moving when the fracture propagates through the weak layer. And we actually haven't done any of the analysis of these data so far. Hopefully have that ready for ISSW. But just the simple act of doing the test, we have some different things we can say. So again, we're looking at interrupting the weak layer. Here you can see faintly there's actually a binder that's shoved in there. It's like a 3-ring binder with the 3-ring part pulled out. And so the weak layer actually runs underneath, and that binder is trying to isolate that slab. And I'll just show you right here. There's a picture where the weak layer was going right through here. And on this particular day, I think we were just using 1 meter columns. And you could take this binder here and shove that in so that it was right along the weak layer, right on top of the weak layer. And no problem, thing would propagate every single time. You could take that binder and move it 5 centimeters up into the slab, and no problem, the slab would run along, hit the binder, the fracture would go up, over, and then on. You push it 10 centimeters up, same thing. When we got to 15 centimeters, we're finally interrupting a healthy part of the slab, and the fracture would go up, go to the middle of the binder, and then kind of parallel this and go right to the surface and arrest. And so what this was showing us was just that, you know, you could see in the videos that when we had that binder up there, we were getting collapse. Like the slab was effectively communicating the fracture forward, and it was also pushing that binder down just a little bit, you know, less than the weak layer was, but still able to, you don't need much collapse to get that fracture to continue to propagate. So that was sort of the first thing we were doing, was just trying to interrupt the weak layer. The next thing that we were doing was creating these big gaps in the weak layer. Now, I was talking with Ned, and Ned was saying, well, you know, in classic fracture mechanics, you know, if you have a material that's getting torn apart and you put a hole there, that can help arrest the fracture. And so he was hypothesizing that if we put a hole in the weak layer, that we might potentially arrest the fracture. It didn't really make sense to me. We had another heated argument, which is a good thing about having a colleague like Ned, because you can have these heated arguments and then you can go out and collect your data. And I just said, boy, if we have a gap, it's just like a whole hole in the weak layer. And what is a surface or weak layer but a series of gaps, right? I mean, it's just like it depends on what scale you look. If you get down to that micro scale, it's just these individual surface ore crystals with gaps between them. And here we just have a bigger gap. And so the idea was, well, can we make a big enough gap that we could arrest the fracture? And we actually made these gaps as big as 70 centimeters. And if you look inside the gap, you can actually see the surface ore back here. So there's the surface ore at the back of the gap, and we measured it, it's 30 centimeters. So the slab, and we've taken out a little bit of the snow below the weak layer, a little bit of snow above the weak layer, and the weak layer runs right through there. And so here's a slow motion video of the gap jump. And watch for the crystals to pop out. You'll see the crystals pop out here, and then you'll see them pop out here too. Right there. See that? So that fracture just came along, boom, went through there, no problem. And it'll be interesting when we analyze the movement of all these disks, if maybe there's a change in the fracture speed as it goes past that gap, or, you know, that might tell us a little bit more about what's actually going on around that gap. So here's Mark thinking, how in the world are we going to support this slab? And I was down at the Forest Service finding these old binders, and I found a bunch of them, and I started cutting them all up into little pieces, and came up with this idea of maybe we could support the slab like this. So here now we have a 2.5 meter beam, and this sort of support structure, whatever you want to call it, is 1.7 meters up the beam, or 170 centimeters. And you take your binder and go about 5 centimeters up into the slab, and the slab is pencil hard. So it's really hard to push the binders in. You're pushing 3 binders right into the top, and then we put these 4 support things below it, and then we just ram a whole bunch of binders underneath that are under the slab to try and somehow support this. And then we would go ahead and test. And it took us actually a couple of different weeks of trying different stuff till we came up with this. And we were able to finally figure out a way that at least it looks like to us that we're arresting the fracture. And so again, watch right through here and you'll see that pop out, but did you see how there was nothing beyond there? So we actually saw the surface ore burst out of the side of the pit wall, stop somewhere in the neighborhood of the binder and not continue on. And we were curious, did we really see that or not see that? And so we actually removed all the binder material and then we just kept cutting. So here's Mark cutting again. And it's a little hard to see because of the contrast, but you'll see this pit wall, you'll see this collapse. Did you see that? It was really subtle, but boom. Doesn't seem like the collapse is quite as big, but we are getting that next layer to collapse. So we know that we did somehow arrest that fracture. The next thing we looked at was cutting slabs down from the surface and then up from the weak layer and trying to see what effect that might have on our fracture. So first, cutting up from the weak layer.
This time we've cut all the way up to right under this ice crust. So all we're leaving.
So the weak layer is down here.
Upper 13 centimeters.
And we've cut this entire slab.
Under ice crust and some lower density snow. And everything else we put a cut through, and we'll see if this will propagate again or slab fracture.
It's an 81 centimeter slab, and we only have 13 centimeters at the top.
Propagate to end.
And when you run it really slow, you can actually see this gap like close up as it pulls, and then it opens back up. That was Eric's response. Now we're cutting down from the top, and here we've cut down 40 centimeters, and we're going to get a propagation to end. See that? So we've cut half of the slab, so we could cut all the way up to right underneath there, or we could cut 40 centimeters, cut the upper half of the slab. Now we've cut 50 centimeters, so we've got a very deep cut into this, and this time we'll actually arrest the fracture. And there you see the fracture arrest through a slab fracture. So, what can we conclude from this? Again, the conclusions have to be tied into these tests. We can't necessarily tie them into avalanches at this point. We've seen this in our experience. You guys have seen it when you're out there in the field doing control work. These slabs can communicate fractures even when the weak layer is compromised. And I know you guys see this, right? I mean, you see it where the weak layer just seems to disappear for a period of time through maybe a wind-blown area or whatnot, but the fracture just keeps going. And so, especially it seems like when you have really deep slabs, those slabs can communicate that beyond areas, or beyond where that weak layer might be compromised. We were able to, if we could completely, or almost completely, I don't know if we completely did, we'll have to look at the videos, but if we could almost completely eliminate the collapse, we were able to arrest the fracture. Okay? And I don't know if, it'll be interesting to look at this and see if we actually did completely arrest the fracture. And I'm not sure how that fits theoretically into this debate of shear versus collapse and whatnot, but it seems like, at least in this case, for these tests on this slope, you needed that collapse to get the fracture to continue. And if you could eliminate that, then we could arrest the fracture. I think one of the take-home points of this, and I think it's something that we've known for a while, but I think that we need to really emphasize to people, and it's just that, as professionals, we understand this, but I'm not sure it's always seeped down into our educational efforts. But the slabs are really important. I mean, for years, we just always focused on weak layers, right? And we, Bruce pulled tons of shear frames. When I did a lot of the spatial variability work I did here, we used shear frames. You're really focused on that weak layer and thinking about that weak layer. And I think we need to, we need to broaden our understanding of the slab and the role that the slab plays. And what you saw in that video that Mark and Eric shot is that even small disturbances in soft snow can arrest fractures. Here's what the top of their pit looked. Here's how deep their cut was, okay? In fist minus snow. And that was enough to arrest the fractures in that really soft snow. It's interesting to note that on this day, there was very limited collapsing observed. Eric and I were there a few days later, like 4 days later, and we got widespread collapsing. And that widespread collapsing, we had like another 10 centimeters of snow, but this lower stuff was starting to strengthen, I think, enough to make those collapses go widespread. We have other cases where only small parts of the slab are necessary to communicate fractures. So this is the snow pit of that one day I was showing you. Here's how far we cut from the weak layer all the way up to here. And this top stuff here was capable of communicating the fracture. Interestingly, one of the times when Eric and I did this, we cut up here and we thought, I mean, it's got to be only this knife-hard layer that is communicating the fracture, right? I mean, that's your only significant layer. This stuff was starting to get a little damp and this. Well, we cut up to here and then we cut down to here and we'd get slab fracture. So this was enough to help along with that to communicate that fracture. And in the same snow pit, we could cut down to here and we could still get propagation. So, it makes a difference which layers you're cutting through, and it also makes a difference which part of the slab you're disturbing. Again, how this ties into avalanches and where these things are resting and why, I think is something that we hope to move toward, but we're probably not there yet. And that's it. It's always a good opportunity to throw a picture of your kid skiing in the end of the slideshow.